Let us now move to the context of the European Union ETS Directive. First of all, one very important point is the European Union vision of climate change and of the fight against climate change. The objective of the European Union, which forms also the basis of this climate change policy at European level, is to decouple emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, from growth. This is really the basic paradigm of European Union policy. You can see on screen a graph which represents this decoupling of emissions. It is a quite important one, looking at 30 years back from now. And actually, it has been issued by the International Energy Agency, which was actually quite proud when issuing it, since it declared that it was the first time in history that we could observe this decoupling from emissions and growth. And you can see indeed that the real growth, accounting for annual change, has been in a rise of around 45%, whereas at the same time, over the last years, there has been a reduction of CO2. This greenhouse gas has been chosen here. The CO2 emissions have been decreased by about 20%. So the conclusion here is quite clear. There is a decarbonization through decoupling emissions from growth. The trends at European level are also quite important. And here we are looking at energy intensity, at energy consumption, and at the gross domestic product. You can see again that there is a decoupling. There are quite separate trends for the three different factors observed here. This is at European level. So, of course, when decoupling growth and emissions, of course, we have to take energy use into account. But if you look at China, especially in 2014, it has reduced its CO2 emissions by 2%, but it has known a certain growth. So this is not only happening at European level. Of course, in China, there is a huge development of renewable energies, and this is quite important to take into account in this reduction of CO2 emissions. And also, it is interesting to note that the United States claim a decline in energy CO2 emissions that have been following a downward trend for the last 23 years, they say. But of course, energy use accounts for only about 35 to 45% of the world's CO2 emissions. So it's not enough to look at this energy use. And for instance, transportation and land use changes are all the major sources which are really important and increasing, by the way, in developing countries. But the European Union especially has followed for its climate policy a twofold objective. The first one is to prevent, so to fight against climate change, and the second one is to try to adapt to climate change. Of course, we are going to look here with a link to the EU ETS Directive to the first objective, which is the prevention of what is called dangerous climate change. And here, based on the IPCC reports, the European Union has endorsed an international position to try to look at a limitation of the global temperature increase to 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial times. This shows again the real link, the close link between the European climate policy and international developments with regard to climate change. So if we look again a little bit further into the European policy, actually the European Union has a longer term vision with regards to the decarbonization. It is already looking until 2050 with the so-called low carbon economy roadmap, which was adopted in 2011. This is not a pure piece of legislation per se, but this is giving indications with regard to the European Union's policy objectives. And you can see on the graph here on the screen that the target is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from 80 to 99% below 1990 levels actually through domestic reductions alone. So it is quite important. And you can see also on this graph the different commitments and the different efforts that the sectors have to bring in. So this is trying to share this burden of decarbonization throughout the society, which is very important. But actually, the EU ETS directive is only a part of this whole objective to decarbonize. And actually, what we have now, the EU ETS directive, is the only adopted legislation until 2020. So we have to move further on. And at the end of this lecture, I'm going to give you some perspectives about the future of the EU ETS directive after 2020. But so now, until 2020, we have a target which is to reduce emissions by 20% by 2020. And this target is actually part of the 3-20-20-20 targets by 2020, the other two being an increase of the share of renewable energies by 20%, and also a decrease in energy consumption by 20%. We will see also later where we stand on this target by 2020. Let's look now at the evolution of CO2 emissions during the, let's say, the last 15 years. Again, 1990, as it has been said, is really a reference year, so it's quite important to have it in mind here. 2005 is also important because it is also taken as a reference year into some international observations of the climate evolutions. And actually, the latest figures that we have here are the ones dated 2013. So at global level and in the different sectors, you can see that the increase in CO2 emissions is very, very clear. Maybe there's only one sector which is an exception where emissions have been quite stable, and this is agriculture. So despite the European Union's and the international desire to fight against climate change, we are observing a quite clear increase in CO2 emissions over the last years. What are the top emitting countries? How are these CO2 emissions reported over the world? You can see that there are two clear top emitters, and the first one is also very clear and quite well known. It is China, which is emitting above 8 gigatons of CO2 per year, or at least it was doing so in 2012. And then the second one is the United States. You can see that the 8 following ones are quite far behind these two first, China and United States. For China, it is quite clear. It is knowing a rapid growth, so it is also increasing its CO2 emissions. But it is also very important to note here that 2/3 of the global emissions actually originate in these top 10 emitting countries. The top 10 have a total of around 21 gigatons of CO2, and the world total in 2012 was a little bit above 31 gigatons of CO2. So really these 10 are very important, and you can see among them only one European country, which is Germany, a quite industrialized country, so this is also important to bear in mind. If we now look at the evolution of CO2 emissions in some major countries, but if we take a closer look in the years 2005 to 2010, you can see the evolution. The United States have known a slight decrease. This is due to shale gas. Russia has been, let's say, almost stable. The European Union has decreased a little bit, but it is not really a big decrease. And at the same time, we are observing a huge increase in China. And if we compare China to another fastly developing country, India, you can see that the Chinese emissions are really increasing at a much faster pace than the Chinese ones. Now, let's take a look at the sector which are important for the CO2 emissions. Why should we do that? This is very important because actually, as we are going to see afterwards, the EU ETS directive is targeting some specific sectors, not the whole economy, but really selected sectors where the European Union believes that a decline in CO2 emissions can provide the most cost-effective solution. This is again a guiding principle, as said before, to ensure the stabilization of climate change into the coming years. So let's take three major countries: China, the United States, and the European Union, which is actually a region. Let's look at the years 1990 to 2013, again taking into account the two reference years, 1990 and 2005, and the latest known data in 2013. What do we see in China? The increase in CO2 emissions is really quite clear. There is a huge increase in all sectors. And of course, the most emitting sectors are energy sectors. Then in the United States, you can observe an increase from 1990 to 2005, and then a decrease until the last known data. So it can be explained here by the so-called shale gas revolution, because through shale gas, the United States have been able to reduce somehow their greenhouse gas emissions. And they have also reduced their coal use, coal being one of the most, let's say, polluting sources of energy. And then the European Union. Actually, the European Union has been quite consistent with the goals which have been adopted at the beginning of the 1990s, because you can see there that, on the contrary to the other two countries, the European Union has really decreased its emissions constantly from 1990 until now. There may be two or three exceptions there, for instance, transport, but otherwise the decrease is quite clear. And again, 1990 here is an important date. It is when the goal to reduce emissions at European Union has been set. So the European Union is doing quite well. Let's now look at the repartition by sector. As I was saying before, if we look into more detail, the most emitting sector in the world is the electricity and heat sector, which accounts for, if we push a little bit, almost a half of emissions, actually 42% in 2012. So this is really the first one, the first emitter. The second one is transport, and then followed in third position by industry. And here again, it is very important to note that there are two sectors, only two sectors, that cover 2/3 of global CO2 emissions, at least in 2012 it was the case. The first one, electricity and heat. Why is that? Because it relies on coal. If you take countries like Australia, China, India, Poland, South Africa, they rely on coal for more than 70% of their energy productions. Then, if we look at the heat share, it has actually doubled from 1990 to 2012, and this is again due to coal. This is the explanation why the heat emissions have doubled during the last years. Then the second sector, it is this transport sector, and actually in more details, it is the road sector which has more than doubled its emissions since 1990. There has been an increase of around 64% in emissions there during this period. Now, let's look at the European Union and what is the share of emissions at European level. Actually, it is almost the same as at global level. And if we take energy supply and energy use and we combine these two sectors here on the graph, we are looking at 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we can really understand why, as we're going to see a little bit later on, the EU ETS Directive is really targeting the energy sector. If we take a look now at industrial processes here in light blue, you can see that it is much lower here in its emissions than at global level.